since she has other engagements. Also, we'd like to greet the various embassies, fellow ambassadors from around the world who are joined, who are joining us in order to discuss uh, different matters. William Chavez from the Middlesex University, London, Carlos Maria Correa, Executive Director of the South Center here in Geneva, although he's an Argentinian by birth. Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington. He's going to connect later on. Professor Ian Ivan Timofev, program director of the Russian Council for International Affairs, who is joining us from Moscow, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs of the Columbia University, New York. And he will connect later on in order to participate in this activity. Once we finish with the Q&A session and conclusions, we're going to have a brief closing ceremony with the Professor Dr. Colum de Sales Murphy, President of the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations of Geneva, and Delcy Rodriguez Gomez, Executive Vice President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, who will always also be joining us. Very good. We declare this session open, and we immediately give the floor to the first professor. And I remind you that the sole purpose of this seminar is to debate with academics, together with them, in order to give a scientific approach and unbiased approach to condemn these unilateral measures. But from knowledge, we need to reproduce knowledge on precisely the impact of this UCM. And based on the scientific approach, these panelists are going to approach this from another perspective, from the perspective of human rights, health, and economic and commercial impacts. Yesterday, we had excellent presentations. And with the presentations of today's session, we're going to have a broad perspective that will allow to have holistic conclusions. It is indeed, therefore, a pleasure to introduce the first panelist, Professor William Chavez, Professor of International Criminal Law in the Middlesex University, London. Mr. Chavez is a Canadian academic specialized in international criminal law and human rights law, professor of international humanitarian law and human rights law in the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, distinguished academic in the field of human rights, genocide, and death penalty. Those are his specialties. He has numerous publications. He was appointed in 2014 head of the United Nations Committee to analyze the intervention of Israel in Gaza and the events there. Therefore, he has a wide experience. And he's our first panelist, Professor Chavez has proposed the following presentation: unilateral coercive measures as a crime against humanity. All panelists, as yesterday, will have 15 minutes for their presentations. And we will continue with the same methodology that we used yesterday. Professor Chavas, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to participate in today's seminar, and you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm very grateful to you for inviting me to participate in this important conference. And my topic, as you've just explained, falls within the general field of international criminal law. I'm going to talk about how the issues we've been discussing relate to international criminal law and how they can be addressed through the mechanisms of international criminal law. There were references by several of the speakers yesterday to issues, including crimes against humanity, and to the referral that Venezuela made to the International Criminal Court dealing with the unilateral coercive measures that is currently being considered by the prosecutor of the court. Some of you may not be that familiar with this system of law. Let me just make a few distinctions with what we were really focused on yesterday. When we're dealing with international criminal law, the focus is on individual perpetrators rather than on state responsibility. I can't draw a fine line here because often there is an overlap and we will accuse a state of committing international crimes as we will accuse individuals. But certainly when we get to the mechanisms of international criminal law, our concern is with individuals. And the question of the legality or the illegality of unilateral coercive measures, which was addressed in great detail by the brilliant speakers yesterday, is really rather secondary or tangential to the question of individual criminal responsibility. I think to give credit where it's due, that this idea was launched in one of the reports of Alfred de Zayas when he was a mandate holder of the special procedures, perhaps 2.5 or 3 years ago. That idea was then addressed. I spoke about this at a conference in Vienna about 2 years ago on the subject and developed the idea of the application of international criminal law, and in particular, the notion of crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity is probably in many ways the broadest category of offense within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And it's quite central to international criminal prosecution. It has a great overlap also with the notion of gross and systematic violations of human rights. Well, about a year, not quite a year and a half ago, Venezuela made a referral to the International Criminal Court concerned with the unilateral coercive measures. This is done pursuant to Article 14 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which enables states parties to refer a situation
remitir situaciones
to the prosecutor
ante la oficina del fiscal para una potencial enjuiciamiento. La Corte funciona en función de las situaciones y en base a estas situaciones, entonces, si esto es válido, identifica a los individuos que podrían ser sujetos a un enjuiciamiento. Comienza entonces con una fase inicial de identificación de la situación y luego entonces pasa a designar e identificar individuos quienes son acusados de acuerdo con el Estatuto de Roma. Este análisis se lleva a cabo en 2 etapas. En la CPI tenemos una fase inicial que es el examen preliminar. Allí el fiscal decide si existen criterios suficientes para continuar con una investigación. Y la remisión de Venezuela se encuentra justamente en esta fase preliminar. Si analizamos o vemos el sitio web de la CPI, van a ver que hay una distinción. Y hay varias situaciones que se encuentran en la fase preliminar de examen. Esta fase es extrajudicial. Se hace en la oficina del fiscal y no está sujeta a ninguna supervisión por parte de los jueces de la Corte. Ellos se involucran solamente una vez que el fiscal ha decidido que ella, porque tenemos a la señora Fatou Bensouda, quien sigue siendo fiscal por algunos días más, luego será Karen Khan, que será el nuevo fiscal, o la fiscal, porque también es una dama, y va a decidir entonces si esta fase preliminar es suficiente como para apoyar en el marco del derecho y en base a los hechos presentados para continuar con una investigación plena. Si vemos en el sitio web, vemos que hay dos situaciones que se refieren a Venezuela. Y en la jerga se llama Venezuela 1 y Venezuela 2. Venezuela 1 comenzó antes y tiene que ver con los alegatos de violaciones de derechos humanos atribuidos al gobierno de Venezuela, que fue iniciado por el fiscal de la Corte y luego se unió varios estados del hemisferio occidental, Canadá y otros países latinoamericanos. Son parte del Grupo de Lima. El Venezuela 2 es lo que nos ocupa, porque Venezuela 2 tiene que ver con las medidas coercitivas unilaterales. Al final de enero del 2020, la República Bolivariana de Venezuela presentó un documento muy detallado al fiscal, de acuerdo con el artículo 14, estableciendo los elementos fácticos y de que la Corte debe escuchar esta revisión. Y hablando de estas medidas, sobre todo las impuestas por Estados Unidos, actualmente la Fiscalía está analizando esto. Hace algunos meses, la fiscal dijo que iba a tratar de tomar una decisión en la fase preliminar del proceso antes de que termine su mandato. Pero en el caso de Venezuela 2, sería muy improbable que ella pueda realmente hacer esto antes de que termine su mandato en la Corte, de manera que le corresponde al próximo fiscal, la tercera fiscal de la Corte, para que se ocupe de este caso. Quiero hacer otras aclaratorias antes de hablar del fondo. La remisión por parte de un Estado solo puede hacerse por parte de un Estado parte de la Corte. Venezuela es la minoría de Estados sujetos a estas medidas tan duras de ser parte justamente del Estatuto de Roma, porque los otros Estados afectados por estas medidas no son Estados parte todavía. No son Estados parte. De manera que no están en el mismo caso que Venezuela, en el sentido de que pueden hacer esta remisión ante la CPI. Hay otros temas que tienen que ver con la jurisdicción de la Corte que explicaré posteriormente, que son pertinentes. Ahora, hay otros derechos que Venezuela tiene como Estado parte del Estatuto de Roma, y es que si la Fiscalía decide no continuar sobre la base de esta remisión, Venezuela tiene la posibilidad entonces de buscar una revisión judicial ante los jueces para cambiar esta decisión, o para lidiar con esto y preguntar a los jueces o pedirles que le solicite al fiscal que retome el análisis. La jurisdicción de la Corte también se basa en la ratificación por parte de Venezuela del Estatuto de Roma. El principio general de jurisdicción de la CPI, y que se aplica a los territorios y a los nacionales de los estados parte que han ratificado el estatuto. Los crímenes cometidos por nacionales venezolanos son sujetos a la jurisdicción de la Corte. Ese no es el problema acá, porque el alegato es que estos crímenes supuestamente fueron cometidos por no nacionales, sobre todo en el caso de Estados Unidos. Pero la ratificación le da a la Corte jurisdicción sobre el territorio de Venezuela. Y en este caso tenemos un problema legal difícil y es un obstáculo que tiene que ser superado antes de que la Corte pueda continuar con el enjuiciamiento. El acto de imponer sanciones unilaterales no se produjo en el territorio de Venezuela, sino que se produjo en el territorio de Estados Unidos y de otros estados que han aplicado estas medidas. Pero Venezuela alega que tienen efectos en el territorio venezolano y por ende son parte de la jurisdicción territorial de Venezuela. Esta es una teoría de la jurisdicción que la Corte todavía no ha aplicado. Se ha aplicado por jurisdicciones nacionales y las más entusiastas en este sentido es Estados Unidos. Va a ser muy importante en la dimensión internacional de estos enjuiciamientos criminales, porque estos ataques, por ejemplo, los ataques cibernéticos, son actos que tienen una dimensión penal y que se llevan a cabo técnicamente en un estado, estados que son difíciles de identificar, o en una tierra de nadie, pero tienen efectos. Venezuela tiene entonces allí un argumento muy sólido que la Corte puede utilizar para aplicar jurisdicción de que estas acciones perpetradas en Estados Unidos, pero por sus efectos sobre el territorio de Venezuela, entonces caen dentro de la jurisdicción de la Corte. Aún no ha habido una decisión en esta materia por parte de la CPI, pero yo creo que hay posibilidades, muy buenas posibilidades de que esto sea aceptado primero por el fiscal y luego por los jueces. Luego hay que abordar el tema que es la jurisdicción sobre el tema. ¿Cuáles son los
in Article 7 of the Rome Statute? Crimes against humanity cover a broad spectrum of, as I mentioned before, acts which very largely overlap with gross and systematic violations of human rights. They must constitute an attack on a civilian population, and they must be perpetrated on a widespread or systematic basis, and they must be pursuant to a state or organizational policy. And here, I think all of these boxes are ticked in the case of the unilateral coercive measures. Here again, the challenge is to demonstrate that the unilateral coercive measures are actually an attack on a civilian population. And yesterday's speakers referred to this. There is certainly an abundance of evidence to demonstrate that the adoption of the unilateral coercive measures is to target the people, the civilian population of Venezuela, in order to induce and provoke political changes that would be desired by those who are imposing the measures. Some of the rights that are addressed in this context, the human rights, are the right to food, the right to health, the right to education, the right to water. The submission by Venezuela demonstrates serious violations of all of these rights that are directly attributable to the unilateral coercive measures. And Venezuela has also demonstrated, I think, a very good case for dealing with the crime against humanity of deportation. the crime against humanity of deportation, which involves population flows, essentially refugee flows, that result from coercive acts. And here, the coercive acts are the unilateral coercive measures that have provoked people of Venezuela to seek to leave the country in order to have a better life. And that's because of the conditions that are directly attributable and deliberately so to the unilateral coercive measures. One final, I realize my 15 minutes is just about up, Ambassador. I will just conclude with a final remark about another hurdle that has to be overcome before the prosecutor will then decide to proceed with a full-blown investigation, and that is what we call admissibility. There's a very important principle at the court that it will not proceed if the state that would ordinarily exercise jurisdiction is unwilling or unable to prosecute the crime. Well, certainly Venezuela is not in a position to prosecute the American leaders who are responsible for the unilateral coercive measures, and the United States is undoubtedly unwilling to do so. There was a regrettable decision by the prosecutor last December on a case filed against the United Kingdom, dealing with the acts of torture and homicide committed by UK troops in Iraq. And the prosecutor finally threw up her hands and she said, basically said the British courts have created such a smokescreen that it's difficult for me to demonstrate in a convincing way that they're unwilling to prosecute those cases. But of course, nobody has been prosecuted for those cases in the United Kingdom. And I think the prosecutor reluctantly was signaling a real shortcoming in the Rome Statute. This problem does not arise with the United States because there's no question of the United States attempting to prosecute its leaders for the unilateral coercive measures. So I don't see that as a problem. So let me just conclude by reminding you all again that the prosecutor there's a turnover, a change in the office of the prosecutor in the coming days. The former prosecutor, I think, showed a lot of determination and indeed a lot of courage. You will remember how she was attacked by the United States because of her willingness to proceed with investigations in the situations in Afghanistan and in Palestine that dealt either with United States agents and officials or with officials and agents of one of the United States' closest allies, Israel. And unfortunately, in some respects, her term is coming to an end and she will no longer be there to take this decision. The new prosecutor is a very competent and able criminal lawyer, but an unknown quantity in terms of the attitude that he will take to this application. If the prosecutor welcomes it and follows it and proceeds with an investigation, this will, I think, raise the prestige of the court, certainly among many of the countries that are represented in this room, but it will also anger some of the other countries, particularly the countries in Europe, the United States, most of them states parties, the United States not a state party, but those countries who have been enthusiastic in many respects about the court. And to the extent the court takes up the challenge of the unilateral coercive measures, I would expect those states to lose some of their enthusiasm for the court. But it will be compensated by what I would hope would be a growing enthusiasm for the court to the extent that it's able to demonstrate that it can administer impartial justice independently and without double standards. Thank you, Chairman, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Professor Chavas, for your intervention. Pasamos ahora entonces al siguiente ponente.
Now we're going to the next presenter, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Carlos Maria Correa, born in Argentina, current director of the South Center based in Geneva. Beyond doubt, Professor Carlos Maria Correa will now complement all this valuable information shared by Professor Chavas about the procedures of the CPI, in particular, very useful and appropriate in the light not only of the referral presented by Venezuela, but also incorporation in the international legal jurisprudence on the unilateral coercive measures as crimes against humanity. He started his mandate as director of South Center in 2018. He was an advisor in intellectual property to the South Center, and the South Center has been present for decades, devoting their work to developing countries and topics related to emerging economies, and mainly in the countries of the South, as the name of the institution reflects. Apart from working with the Argentinian government, the professor has been also director of several interdisciplinary centers linked to the Faculty of Law in the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And he is a well-known author of different topics related to intellectual property. He's also a PhD from the University of Buenos Aires, and we are very honored to count on his participation in this conference. And he has selected an interesting title for the comprehensive analysis of the unilateral coercive measures, and makes reference to the impacts and the effects of the unilateral coercive measures on the access to health, and analysis from the standpoint of law and ethics that we deem very pertinent within the context of this pandemic. You have the floor, Professor Correa, and we thank you once again. Thank you, Ambassador Constant. Thank you for this introduction and for the invitation to the South Center to participate in this important conference. I extend my congratulations for these fruitful sessions with such remarkable presenters. I'm going to make 5 preliminary observations and then dwell on the specific topic that has to do with the direct and indirect effects and impact of the unilateral coercive measures on fundamental rights, such as the right to health. So my first comment has to do with the arguments that were explained yesterday. The UCMs are a flagrant violation of the Charter of the United Nations and the principle of international law, but they are also a violation of the Chapter 9 of the UN Charter, referred to the principles of cooperation in socioeconomic terms. These measures are a denial of such principles, of these fundamental principles of the multilateral order. As it was correctly said yesterday, these measures are used to inflict damage, not only to the government, but also to the populations, because the people are ultimately the victims and suffer the consequences. So the population is ultimately receiving the devastating effect of these unfair measures that violate international law. Second comment has to do with the scope of these measures. These unilateral measures have the purpose of toppling government or replace political systems in their scope. These measures have the purpose of topple governments and change the methodology of the institutions that have to do with the culture of the countries, with the history of the country. So these measures have a systemic character. This concept of unilateral coercive measures gives the idea initially of being temporary measures, but in reality they are systematic measures that aim at blocking the normal functioning of the states and to change the modes of life and the livelihoods of the people and the way institutions work in the countries. Third comment, we can make a comparison between the interventions that have taken place by the application of these measures. And if we compare them, for example, with the purpose of a military intervention, the purpose is to topple a government and to change a political system. Professor Chavas mentioned also the criminal aspects of these measures because they put the population in a situation of fragility. If we compare the effects of a war and of these measures, they're equivalent. The infrastructure is damaged, the life of people is at risk, even people die as a consequence of lack of medicine. And if we clearly, they don't have an immediate effect as a military bombing, but there is a sustained effect in time that can have devastating consequences, similar to a war. So we have there this idea of the impact of these measures and the equivalence that we can make with, for example, military interventions. And fourth, I have the impression that when the developed countries decide to apply these measures, they confuse leadership with hegemony. The developed countries have the power to exercise leadership. They have the resources. Within the context of the COVID-19, the developed countries have lacked this leadership to bring a solution to the pandemic, but they have this capacity of leading. Well, leading means build coalition on the grounds of certain values, but these unilateral coercive measures are an expression instead of acts of domination, of acts of force, of exercise of economic power, of technology power that is expressed in several aspects. For example, the control of financial wire transfers. The states that are suffering the consequences of these measures are blocked. And Jeffrey Sachs is going to mention this topic that is vital. And fifth comment, Mr. Ambassador, has to do with the terminology used. Some of the presenters yesterday made reference to this. This name of unilateral coercive measures don't give you the impression of being systemic, but in reality, they affect a third of the world population. These unilateral coercive measures are not released by the application of certain exceptions. The exceptions are insufficient. So what we're talking about here and in this conference, the idea is not to widen the exceptions, but in reality to denounce the uselessness of the application of these measures. And it's important at this point to remind that all legal framework and rules are based in values related to ethics. And these unilateral coercive measures not only represent a clear violation of these legal rules, but they represent a violation of the lack of ethics and the lack of what is an ethic behavior. The golden rule of not doing to others what we don't want people to do against us. So these measures are a threat from every single point of view, and it's important for the international community understand that this is not only about legal rules, but violation of ethical principles. Now, to give you an example of the impact of these measures, I want to talk about the field of health. These unilateral measures have a devastating effect in the health systems of countries, and the health is not the only fundamental right affected. Also, the right to development is affected by these unilateral coercive measures. The right of access to food and other human rights. The South Center frequently presents, upon request of the Secretary General of the UN, several reports on the situation, for example, in the case of Cuba. Cuba has suffered blockade for more than 60 years. It has been the longest and the most unfair economic blockade in contemporary history. And South Center presented a report upon request of the UN Secretary General. We saw that the Cuban company in charge of supplying medical inputs did in 2016 57 requests to companies in the US for the purchase of products, paying the fair price of medical inputs and equipment. 50 out of the total number of these companies didn't respond to the request made by the Cuban company. 3 of these companies responded that they could not provide the supply to Cuba as a consequence of the sanctions applied by the US government. And I would like to highlight that even if Cuba has been blocked, they have continued to progress in the area of medicine and biotechnology. Is one of the countries in the South that has developed a capacity to produce a vaccine against the COVID-19. And many countries have expressed their hope for this initiative that is taking place in Cuba, because some countries are relying and depending on the private companies in the Western world. But on the other hand, there are also efforts for vaccines in Cuba and Russia. Yesterday, it was mentioned that it was important to deal with these unilateral coercive measures. And the visit that the special rapporteur did to Venezuela provided very important information and clear examples on the impact of this unilateral coercive measure in terms of access to health and how they impact the right to life. Ms. Duhan mentioned also damages on infrastructure similar to the ones experienced by countries in war. Also, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela mentioned that some equipment cannot work properly because you don't have access in Venezuela to spare parts. The special rapporteur was highlighting that 20% of the medical equipment is working due to these problems of maintenance. They mentioned also the access to power supply. The lack of spare parts and equipment makes it difficult for Venezuela to provide electricity to the population. And so the equipment is working at 20% of their capacity. The access to water that is fundamental for health. The special rapporteur also highlighted that in some cases, you, as a regular citizen, sometimes have access twice a week. Also, the lack of chemicals for the purification of water. There has been a remarkable loss of medical staff in the hospital. There is a 50% of vacancies in hospital. The lack of access to medicines, to vaccines. Even within these dramatic circumstances of the COVID-19, the countries that are victims of these unilateral coercive measures continue to suffer the impact of these measures because they don't have access to essential inputs to face this pandemic. Also, the report of the special rapporteur mentioned a reduction on the medical treatments, an increase in the child mortality rate, also in the maternal mortality rate. So we are seeing devastating effects and impact. So it's important to continue collecting information, and South Center is interested in supporting these tasks. So these unilateral coercive measures cannot be perceived as abstract elements, because these measures create impact on the Venezuelan society, for example, in a flagrant violation of fundamental rights. Yesterday, the Chinese ambassador was mentioning that these measures are applied by countries that advocate themselves as defenders of human rights, and instead these measures are a political tool that, and they violate the fundamental rights of countries that receive these measures. So to finish my intervention, these unilateral coercive measures are not an expression of leadership, but an expression of the will of domination. These measures must be denounced and combated as violations of legal principles, but also as violations of the ethical principles. And I insist that the humanitarian exceptions should not be considered as enough. And third of all, there are certain immediate actions that must be taken, and I hope this is discussed. For example, it's necessary a reform in the payment system. It's inconceivable that our countries cannot purchase products and do financial transactions as a consequence of blockades. And fourth, also, I would like to ratify that the South Center is willing to contribute to address this topic, and we're going to support the mandate of the rapporteur of the United Nations and promote the South-South cooperation to overcome the challenges associated with these unilateral coercive measures. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for such a clear presentation associated to the issue of health and the willingness of the South Center to help with this, because it's an important ally to continue working. So this call for the lifting of the unilateral coercive measures, due to their huge ethical cost, must make us understand the importance to deepen our knowledge on these unilateral coercive measures and their impact.
These ambassadors of Syria to UNOC, and also ambassador of Iran. Thank you very much to our dear friends for being here with us. And of course, you will have the floor after our panelists if you want to give us your impression of that. Ambassador of Pakistan and Ambassador of Zimbabwe, thank you very much. You have opened right now your camera, turn on your camera. Thank you very much, and be very welcome also among us. Vamos ahora a...
Now we're going to continue with our...
We're going to introduce Professor Ivan Imofeev from Russia, Director of Programs of the Russian Program Russian Council of International Affairs. He's a member since 2016. He is responsible of this center, of its projects. He has worked with Russian and foreign experts, governmental leaders, business leaders related to international affairs and public Russian activities. He's the leader of the Euro-Atlantic program, and he was the head of the Analytics Center, an associate professor of the MGIMO University. And he obtained his doctorate in political science, and he has more than 80 publications. Dr. Timofeev was elected a member of the Military Academy of Science in Russia, and it is indeed a pleasure to have him, for him to give a broad perspective of these unilateral coercive measures and be able to talk with the various schools and universities of Russia on this important topic. Professor Timofeev will talk about the impact of secondary sanctions in companies and their indirect effects.
Dr. Timofeev, you have the floor, and thank you again for your acceptance to participate in this international conference. Be very welcome.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your kind introduction, as well as for the invitation to participate in the conference. I learned a lot from the previous speakers, and indeed it's a pleasure to share some of my expertise. We are working a lot on sanctions issues at Russian International Affairs Council, gathering databases on sanctions use and implementations and behaviors of business under sanctions. And today I would like to stress the issue of secondary sanctions and enforcement as an essential element of the problem of sanctions and their impact on companies and individuals worldwide. So this presentation is based on a number of our research. So this is something which is already grounded in a number of academic publications. And I remember that we had a discussion with Professor Dovgan, who mentioned yesterday that enforcement and secondary sanctions is a separate issue, and I'm very grateful to Professor Dovgan for mentioning this, and I hope that to some extent this problem will be reflected in their work of in their forthcoming reports on the impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. So one of the questions which was raised yesterday by Professor Dolgan was why business overcomplies? What makes international business following the legislation of the sanctions initiators, even in the cases when the legislation formally allows businesses to conduct transactions with sanctioned jurisdictions or with entities or individuals connected to sanctioned jurisdictions. And well, my general answer on this question is fear. Is fear of the U.S. enforcement action to actually enforce the existing sanctions regimes fixed in the U.S. legislation. I must say that in comparison with other sanctions initiators, the U.S. is most advanced. So the United States enjoys a very developed and very well-trained bureaucracy on their implementation and enforcement of sanctions, and its practice is quite rich, and there are lots of cases of enforcement actions, right? There is a big debate about the efficiency of sanctions, and if you look at the US expert assessments, they are more or less agreed with each other that sanctions are ineffective in terms of making targets change their political course. But this is only one aspect of efficiency. If you look on the behavior of business, we will see that sanctions are very effective because businesses, unlike states, are changing their behaviors quite significantly under the threat of US enforcement, right? So when it comes to the diet of regulator versus company, sanctions work much more efficient in a much more efficient way than in the diet initiator state, target state. Europeans are trying to improve their capacities in terms of enforcement. I wouldn't say that they are comparable to Americans. The European practice is much less, though there are enforcement actions on the level of nation states. Great Britain now will be more active, taking into account the Brexit and the re-emergence of the UK separate sovereign, let's call it like this, sanctions policy. But I would like to stress on the US experience, taking into account that US is a key initiator of sanctions globally, and that the US has the most developed enforcement policy and in terms of institutions and practice. So what businesses, what are the key fears of business? Well, the first and the major fear is the criminal prosecution, because the United States legislation implies criminal prosecution in case of willful violation of the US legislation. I mean, first of all, and most of all, IEPA, and we all know that IEPA implies up to 20 years of prison for sanctions violation and more than 1 million financial penalty. Though it's quite rare, and I don't know the cases, any case when such a sentence of 20 years was issued by the US courts, but still the threat is there. And usually in the practice of criminal investigations, Department of Justice, the US Department of Justice combines criminal allegations connected to IEPA with other ones, with fraud, with economic crimes, with conspiracy, etc. So usually there are several counts. This is not only one count, but several counts in the practice. And the recent cases are quite illustrative. For instance, a Russian citizen, Oleg Nikitin, is now in the American prison, waiting for under the arrest, under the criminal investigation, waiting for his sentence. He pledged guilty for the attempt to buy an equipment for a Russian company in energy sector. And his partner, Gabriele Villone, from Italy, was sentenced for 28 months in prison last year. One of the recent actions connected to Venezuela under the auspice of the Department of Justice is, for instance, the seizure of oil and of cargo from 4 oil tankers, which were heading from Iran, supposedly from Iran, to Venezuela, and they were detained by Americans, and the oil was seized. The gasoline oil was seized, right? So another fear, another threat, another risk is secondary blocking sanctions, as we call them, sanctions for sanctions violations, right? So they are imposed against foreign persons which are dealing with sanctioned persons. And in regard to Venezuela, I would stress at least to Venezuela and Russia, the cases which are closer to our experience. I would refer to two cases. One of them is the designation of Russian Eurofinance Mosnarbank. Actually, this is a joint Russia-Venezuela venture. This is a joint bank which was established um, to proceed and to conduct their contracts and supply to provide financial supply to the contracts on Russia-Venezuela cooperation. It was designated by the US, so now it is blocked. And two other examples, the blocking of two subsidiaries of Russian Rosneft. This is the leading Russian oil company. These subsidiaries are based in Switzerland and they are focused on trading. And both were designated for cooperation with Venezuela, with PDVSA. But the practice is much richer, of course. So there are numerous cases of secondary sanctions. One of the recent large case, right, is the designation of COSCO shipping tanker for transporting the Iranian oil. And well, COSCO shipping tanker is a huge global company, and their resonance on the markets was quite high. So the threat of this designation is very sensitive for business, because designation means that the company has no opportunity to use dollar system. Other banks, for instance, in European Union, are immediately canceling transactions. This is the same is for Chinese banks, for Asian banks, etc. So even when the transactions are non-dollar, banks are very careful about these transactions. Why? And here comes the third risk, the risk of financial penalty. And on the first side, financial penalty is not so scary in comparison with criminal prosecution or secondary sanctions, but because it allows the company to continue its performance, but the financial penalty may be very high. Well, our data shows that we aggregated the data from the US Department of the Treasury, and we counted that in the recent 11 years, there have been 237 cases of OFAC financial penalties. And OFAC alone gathered $5.6 billion. And banks paid the majority of this sum, more than 80%. Most of these banks were European. And OFAC is not the only agency which is imposing financial penalties. This is also the Department of Commerce when it relates to trade and exports. This is Department of Justice in case of settlement agreements on criminal investigations. At some points, banks have to pay quite significant sums. I would refer to Standard Chartered bank case when it paid more than $600 million in 2019. UniCredit Bank paid nearly the same. So the sums are quite high. And the practice of the regulator, the practice of OFAC, is to investigate the cases when the substance is ambivalent, right? Where even when the substance is not, the substance of the case is not much clear, right? When it may be interpreted in one way or another. Still, the regulator may impose fines. I will give you an example, for instance, of ExxonMobil when it made 6 contracts with Rosneft, which I mentioned. Rosneft is not blocked, but it's under sectoral sanctions. But the contracts were signed by Igor Sechin, the president of Rosneft, and he's designated. He's in the SDN list, right? And OFAC imposed financial penalty against ExxonMobil, $2 million. But Exxon, and that was quite a contradictory case, and because Mr. Sechin is not an owner of this company, right? He's the head, but he's not an owner. And ExxonMobil has successfully challenged this decision in the federal court in the United States, in the Southern District of Texas, and they won. But such victories are quite rare. So usually courts in the United States take the side of the federal authorities, take the side of the Department of the Treasury and of other agencies, as practice shows. So the business prefers to just to cooperate with OFAC and with other agencies. We analyze data of business choices using these 200 cases which I mentioned, and almost 100% of companies prefer to cooperate with OFAC, right? So they, when the investigation started, they provided OFAC with relevant info, so they didn't cancel anything, and they were trying to be as good as it is possible, right? So business is very loyal to the demands of the regulator. Of course, there are attempts by some states to create entities which are specially focused on the businesses which are sanctioned by the United States. But these businesses are quite constrained. They are facing the risk of criminal investigations. Their management faces the risk of imprisonment in the United States, in the countries with which United States has an agreement on extradition, etc., etc. So that's not a piece of cake as well. To sum up, I would say that these issues is quite really a matter of discussion, right? But enforcement and secondary sanctions, criminal prosecution in the United States is a heavy factor which affects the behavior of banks, and this leads to another issue in terms of human rights, underbanking. So it turns out that the persons under sanctions, they cannot enjoy their rights for financial services. They are underbanked, right? So they have to use some archaic schemes of transactions, and this by the way creates more grounds for corruption, because when the transactions are not transparent, there are more preconditions for corruptions and other financial crimes. And in fact, this is a huge issue which in one way or another should be reflected on the multilateral forum. Thanks a lot for your kind attention.
Gracias, doctor, por su participación y por su presentación tan importante. Es muy importante conocer las consecuencias económicas.
Because, of course, it is very important to know that not only governments or individuals are focuses for unilateral coercive measures, but also all the economical system is being damaged by those measures itself. Vamos ahora a continuar agradeciendo una vez más.
We're going to continue with, and we thank the participation of Professor Timofeev. We're going to continue with our next presenter. It is my honor to introduce Professor Mark Weisbrod, who is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Dr. Weisbrod is the chairperson of Just for Foreign Policy, a non-governmental organization devoted to reform the foreign policy of the U.S. The professor received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan in the US, and since 1999, he's been working, and when he founded the Center for Economic and Policy Research, he gathers a number of experts that, along with him, conduct important economic research projects, and we have seen that he has made reference to the impact of unilateral coercive measures in Venezuela. We are very pleased to have him here in this important international academic conference with a presentation entitled Sanctions, U.S. Sanctions as a Collective Punishment and Their Economic and Human Cost. Dr. Weisbrot,
you have the floor and be our guest, please. We cannot hear you. Can you unmute, please, your microphone?
I'm sorry.
Now it's okay. Thank you.
And thank you, Hector, and thanks to everyone for being here, and also Alfred for inviting me and organizing. I just want to, I'm going to focus. How much time do I have? Do you know?
Well, in principle, you have 15 minutes, but
okay.
to be our guest, I guess that we will have time. After you,
okay.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs, then we can arrange between you.
Okay. I'm sorry I was late. I must have, the time I had for this was at 10, not earlier. But anyway, so let me talk about first one of the issues. You know, Jeffrey Sachs and I don't know if Jeff is going to be here, but you know, we did a paper in 2019 that you mentioned. And one of the points that I made, and we're trying to bring this out in the US Congress and the media, is that these sanctions would be, and that's why the title of the paper, this would be a crime under both the Geneva and the Hague Conventions. And I don't know if anybody talked about that yet. Did anyone talk? Okay, so I think this is important because people can understand this when you talk to them, when we're trying to get members of Congress. You know, people don't like to say this, that the United States is doing something that would be literally without any ambiguity. It would be a crime under these conventions if there were a war going on. So it's just a technicality that it's not a war crime. It's just that nobody is shooting anyone in this conflict. And so it's obvious when you explain this to people that something that is a crime when people are shooting at each other and bombing each other, it should be a crime when you're not doing that also at the same time. And it does, you know, and the UN has actually had a couple of publications basically saying that these really should be war crimes, and or they should be crimes in the same way that they are crimes under these conventions, that they're war crimes. And of course, it's also a violation of the Charter of the Organization of American States, and much of international law as well. So I think that's important, and we've been trying to hammer at this. I'll say a little bit about what we do here in the U.S. in Congress, because I think it's good for people to know that you know, there is an effort here, and it's not impossible. Well, for one thing, every time, you know, there are sanctions imposed here, all the executive orders that imposed sanctions on Venezuela since 2015, the executive had to declare in writing in the executive order that Venezuela poses an extraordinary, and same for Iran, poses an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States, which is, of course, ridiculous. But that's in the law because you know, because it's because of the violation of international law. If you couldn't say that was true, and that's why it's in the law, and that's why they have to tell this lie every time they do an executive order. So it is relevant here as well. And one of the things we had last year, one of our friends in Congress introduced a bill that would say, that would prescribe that the Congress had to approve any kind of financial or broad economic sanctions. Of course, the 2015 sanctions, which targeted individuals, specifically in Venezuela, that also caused a lot of economic damage, but nothing like what came later in 2017, 18, 19. And I think, again, I don't know what people have discussed, but it's very clear, like the recognition of Guaido as a so-called interim president, that cut off Venezuela from all kinds of income and assets overseas. And by the way, and this has really destroyed the economy. The best estimate that I have seen for and most current for the economic damage, the loss of GDP is 75% since 2000, from 2015 through 2020. I have never seen anything like that anywhere. I mean, I'm sure some country at war at some time in the history of the world could have lost that, but I haven't seen that. That's just enormous. And, this is one of the things that you can see is very clearly the result of the sanctions. And this is a part of the struggle that we're having. A lot of our work is in Congress, but we also talk to the media as much as we can. And the US media is now mentioning, kind of in passing, they mention the sanctions when they talk about how bad the economy is. They didn't do it at all for a while, and they don't really talk about it much, but they do acknowledge that the sanctions are harming the economy, but it's kind of murky, like how much is due to what. And so I think it should be clear, to not only to economists, but to everyone, that you don't have this kind of damage without the sanctions. And, any mistakes that the government made in 2012 or 13, that don't have anything to do with what's going on today, because this is, when you have these kind of sanctions, you could have the best team of economists and the best government in the world, and you couldn't get out of this because you're cut off from international finance. You're losing all this trade. Francisco Rodriguez, who's an opposition economist, probably knows the economy better than anyone. The Venezuelan economy. He said he estimated that Venezuela lost $17 billion from the 2017 sanctions in oil revenue. And if you look at the cost of food and medicine, for example, what the government was spending when the economy was running at, was growing quite rapidly back in 2012, it was like $2.5 billion a year. So this is a massive impact. But I think the biggest impact of all is probably the hyperinflation. Hyperinflation does not last forever. Oh, there's Jeff. Good. He knows this very well. He's written quite a bit about it. I mean, the median hyperinflation in Latin America since World War II lasted 4 months. And Venezuela has been 40 months. It's one of the longest. If you take the classic definition of hyperinflation, you have to have at least 1 month that's over 50%, which would be 13,000% at an annual rate. It's 40 months. They're one of the only ones in world history that's been longer than that was Nicaragua, where they had 58 months, and that was during the war. So it's the same thing. You have to have this external force that stops the hyperinflation, and And, you know, and the other thing is, of course, hyperinflation is not that hard to get rid of. And Jeff can talk about that. He did it in Bolivia in 1985. He was part of it, a big part of it. You know, they got rid of hyperinflation. I don't know, what was it, 10 days? You know, you can do that if you, through exchange rate stabilization, but Venezuela can't do that. It couldn't restructure its debt from the beginning of these sanctions. It couldn't do anything to recover. And this is a horrible thing in so many ways, because, I mean, the human cost is very high. And, you know, in our paper, we just looked at the mortality, the change in mortality that was available. There was one statistic available from 2017 to 2018. And the increase in mortality was 40,000 people. And that was the only reason we got that number is because the UN leaked it. It was a survey done by an opposition group, and they didn't want to release it because they didn't want people to know. And they never did another. The survey was supposed to come out all the years since 2018. It hasn't come out. And so, and I'm currently organizing a survey that will try and get an accurate number right now, but that will take a little while, but it will happen. But I want to say that that is, you know, some right-wing economists criticized us for mentioning them. We didn't, you know, say that this was a point estimate or something, but for saying that it was this magnitude because of the mortality. But if you actually look at what's being done now in terms of estimating deaths from COVID, it's the same thing. They're looking at the change in mortality to get an estimate, because you don't really know how many people die from COVID. There's the ones that are shown to have died or recorded as deaths from COVID, but then you have also in many countries now and worldwide, people are estimating based on the change in mortality. And I would guess that it's in the hundreds of thousands now. So this is a horrible crime. And just so there's no doubt about the intention, we have statements from the Trump administration from, in 2019 in March. Pompeo was on the record saying, and I'm quoting, "The circle is tightening. The humanitarian crisis is increasing by the hour. I talked with our senior person on the ground there in Venezuela last night. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from." He said that, referring to the sanctions. And then Human Rights Watch called attention to another statement he made on the strategy of sanctions with regard to Iran. He said, things are much worse for the Iranian people. He's talking about the sanctions again. And we are convinced that will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime. So it's pretty explicit that it is, and this fits the definition of collective punishment under the Geneva and Hague Convention. You're punishing the population in order to achieve regime change. Now, in terms of the Congress in the US, I want to give just one example. I mean, the Congress in the US does have more influence on foreign policy than in most countries, I think. And that's why we've focused a lot of efforts there. But I want to mention that it is possible, and it's good for when people around the world can say things about it, and when they can get it in the media, it does make a difference, because the main reason they're getting away with this is that hardly anyone even knows what is being done. But to give that one example, we had a success. It took 6 years. But last year we did have the Congress, both houses of Congress voted to order the president to cut off logistical support, mid-air refueling, and intelligence sharing to Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the war in Yemen. And that was, and Trump, of course, ignored the law, but Biden is still thinking about what he's going to do. Well, the law has to be redone, and that's what people are working on now because it's a new Congress. But nonetheless, I think that it is it was a big step forward, and it will happen again. And I think the U.S. will get. I mean, the refueling is supposedly stopped, and but unfortunately, the U.S. is still supporting the blockade. I won't talk about that here, but I'm just saying that this is possible. And again, all the media, any media that anyone can get anywhere in the world, I think is helpful. Have I done my 15 minutes yet, or somebody has to cut me off, or I'll keep going? Anybody? I'm sorry, I haven't paid close attention to the time. Okay, I can keep going a little bit longer. So the other part of this, of course, is, and this was, oh, so sorry, go ahead. Is there someone else speaking? Just my view changed. Okay.
No, go ahead. It was me, because you have said that you were stopping, then it was me, but please go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I think that's, I mean, that's most of what I wanted to put forward here. I think the fact that these sanctions, that they're able to use secondary sanctions and the threat of secondary sanctions, I think other people mentioned that, but they did this to India and even Russia, you know, threatened them with secondary sanctions for buying Venezuelan oil, and they're still doing these things. And Biden hasn't changed it. And I think this is what makes it so powerful. And it is, you know, it is like war in terms of the casualties, the illegality of it, of a war, and the, I mean, a war of aggression, you could call it. And I think that the other part of it is, and I know this from talking to other governments, is that people in governments really worry more about getting on the wrong side of the US foreign policy apparatus, because they could have their economy completely destroyed and indefinitely even because of these kinds of sanctions. So I think the most important thing that people can do around the world is to highlight this, the illegality, the crime, and of course, to the extent that people can get around the sanctions, that also helps. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Westbrook, for your participation in our conference.
Thank you.
And I hope you can be with us in the section of questions and answers just after the intervention of our next and last speaker of today, which is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I want to welcome him warmly and thank him also for his presence with us today and for have accepted to be a panelist in our activity. We are very glad and very honored also to count on you on the dialogue that we are engaging right now about this important issue on the illegal coercive measures. Como les he dicho entonces, nuestro último panelista es el doctor y profesor Jeffrey.
So the last speaker is this well-known academic leader in sustainable development. He's director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He is a university professor. Professor Sachs also is director of Health Institute, University of Columbia, in 2012 and 2016. head of solutions of sustainable solutions of the UN, commissioner of the broadband of the UN, and defender of the SDGs between 2001 to 2018, special advisor of 3 general secretaries of the UN, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and Antonio Guterres. I'm not going to mention the numerous books, articles published by Professor Sachs, which are part of his vast curriculum. And being a teacher for more than 20 years in Harvard, and his militancy in favor of sustainable development, making an authoritative voice in the field of unilateral coercive measures. He's going to speak about coercive measures and the sustainable development targets or goals. We are very pleased because also we are bear in mind the 2030 agenda. We need to bear in mind this agenda and the impact that UCMs could have on that agenda.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador. Thanks to all of your excellencies, ambassadors, and also my colleagues that I see on the screen. And I'm delighted also to follow the wise and valuable remarks of Mark Weisbrod, my colleague and co-author, and we've been working together on these issues for many years. Well, the question practically is how to constrain a very aggressive, obnoxious, and arrogant US government, because what we're talking about overwhelmingly is US foreign policy. And the problem, of course, is that with these unilateral coercive measures, they're extremely powerful and almost no cost directly to the protagonist of them, to the US government. The American people have no idea at all. These are not voted, these are not known, these are not debated. Anyway, the American people know nothing about the rest of the world in general and don't care very much. So the amount of attention is very low. You don't have to mobilize armies. You can do as much damage as a war through a single bureaucratic maneuver of closing the bank accounts or threatening banks that do business with Venezuela or Iran or other countries. So it's an extremely powerful tool, completely obnoxious, completely against the law, completely destructive, and usually done for unbelievably stupid reasons, because half the country that I live in is incredibly stupid and very powerful and very stupid. So this is where we stand. My guess is the Venezuela sanctions, 98% or so had to do with Trump's crazy idea of this being crucial to win the state of Florida in 2020. I don't think it really had much to do with anything else, because he doesn't care about anything else also. He was no ardent opponent of anybody, really. I don't think he could give a damn about Maduro or anybody else. But he wanted to win the state of Florida, and Marco Rubio is a nasty, cynical person. And so they had to decide whether they were going to launch a war or whether they were just going to crush Venezuela peacefully, and in quotation marks, peacefully. And that's what they decided to do, of course. In fact, Trump, as you know, when he first sat down with Latin American leaders in 2017, said, why don't we just invade Venezuela? Because that was very much on his mind. But he was talked out of it by his friends, so they decided to do the damage in other ways. The consequences of these measures are huge. So I don't think one can doubt the effectiveness of them in terms of damage. Their political efficacy is zero. They do not result in political consequences, even of the kind that the US wants. These are just destructive measures. They're not even efficacious from a foreign policy point of view. They're just destructive, but they are highly destructive. According to the IMF's most recent data, the US dollar GDP per capita of Venezuela in 2016 was $9,000. In 2021, it's $1,500. That is a drop of 80%. As Mark Weisbrod said, you'd have to comb the historical records even to find wartime economies reduced by half or more. And this is a peacetime destruction. If you measure GDP per capita and purchasing power, parity measurement as is indicated for some purposes, the Venezuelan economy went from $14,400 in 2016 to $4,400 in 2021. I have no doubt, as a practicing economist that has been doing development economics for 41 years, that the overwhelming reason for this is the sanctions. So I know a lot of silly people who say, oh, how do you know? But they're very inexperienced. You cannot get a collapse like this without isolating an economy. This is not the mismanagement of the Venezuelan economy. This is crushing the economy by absolutely the same as if there was a naval blockade around the harbors and blockade of the airspace. It's the same thing. It's just done by banking. And it's done because the US government and the US dollar for the moment is the currency of settlement, and extraterritoriality of sanctions applies in practice because the US, especially under Trump, but it's more than that, is ready to arrest executives, to sanction companies, to carry out its will, however lawlessly, in order to satisfy the White House prerogatives. And that's really what we're facing here. So what to do? There are the rational ways and and other ways. First, I think that at every opportunity, these issues, I know that it's not decisive, but these issues should be taken up by the United Nations. I would hope that Venezuela and Iran's friends would take them up in the UN Security Council, and then when that fails, to take them up under Uniting for Peace in the General Assembly. Because a majority of countries should be aghast at what's going on and should rebuke the United States for what it's doing. And I can't really imagine not having a majority of the 193 UN member states telling the United States, you can't behave like this under the UN Charter. So I personally would like to see continued diplomacy, because I believe in the UN. As fraught and difficult as it is, I think it's our best and perhaps only hope for peace on the planet. And so I would like to keep pushing UN scrutiny, UN resolutions, UN debate, and so forth. So count me in if I can help on any of that as an expert on panels that the General Assembly might call. This is important. We have to stop these unilateral sanctions. By the way, just to put a footnote, the United States is now doing the same thing against China. And this is really dangerous. It's not going to crush China the same way that it can crush Venezuela, but it's really dangerous. And it's a kind of US foreign policy madness and arrogance that goes back actually truly for centuries, but in the modern times for decades. And my countrymen don't get it, and they're not going to get it very easily because it's so deeply embedded in American arrogance. But the rest of the world gets it. So first, I would start with the UN, really to continue to try to push that. Second, I would try also with the European Union and Latin America. In 2017, 2018, I spent a lot of time speaking with Latin American leaders saying, what are you doing siding with Trump on this business? Mr. Guaido is not president. It is lawless to take PDVSA's finances. It is lawless to financially blockade Venezuela. And by the way, it won't work, is what I told them. Whatever you think, it won't work. And I said, you don't know how stupid this president is and how completely without sense American foreign policy is on these issues. This is not calculated. This is improvisation. And I said that to a lot of Latin American leaders. Well, I don't know. They don't want to upset the US, so they joined the alliance. I said it to European foreign policy leaders. Okay, I'm ready to say it again and again because I was proved right. Not that it was such a genius observation. It was rather predictable. But now we've gone on for 4 years. We have a new president. And what Trump was doing was really stupid. So there's a chance now that Europe will say, okay, we need absolutely to do something different. Latin American neighbors of Venezuela are, by the way, they're all in trouble. So Colombia, I mean, all through the Andes, it's a mess. The Caribbean, because of COVID also. We've got to get past conflict and actually get to recovery. And there isn't a country in Venezuela's region that isn't in trouble right now. And any one of them that is betting on the United States to bail them out should look at the words of Vice President Harris last week in one of the most uncomfortable, botched, mindless foreign policy forays to Latin America to go lecture on corruption in the middle of COVID catastrophe, poverty, drought. I mean, they don't know what they're doing in my country. I promise you they don't know what they're doing right now. But I think it's possible for Europe and your neighbors to get it at this point that we need a different approach and to say to the US government, which is a lot more rational, not necessarily more sensible, but a lot more rational than it was under Trump, that this isn't working, we need to do something else. I think it's really possible, especially after 4 years of failure. So that would be my second idea, is Europe and Latin America, neighbors, come on, let's do something reasonable. A third, and may sound surprising and maybe a little bit hard, but I would try it, is the IMF technical staff. What I would like them to look at is the catastrophe that Venezuela has gone through, because it's shocking. You could look at their entire roster of member states, and there isn't one that has gone through the catastrophe Venezuela's gone through. And I have friends and students all through the IMF, and I want to tell them, you need to understand this as professional macroeconomists. This is a catastrophe, and you need to be ready to help with stabilization. You don't have to get into the middle of politics right now, but you need to understand what's happening better than you do. And I think that there's value in that, knowing kind of the professional bureaucracy at the IMF. They can be systematically helpful, actually. It may sound surprising, but I think it's actually true. But mostly I want macroeconomists to look at this, because I want to say to them, to my students and my colleagues over decades, have you ever seen a collapse like this, ever? And Mark and I would say, we don't know of another case like this, of a loss of 80% of GDP in peacetime. So I think that this is another route. Okay, fourth, I don't want to give up on the United States. It's a new administration. I'm not so far in love with the foreign policy. It strangely has, it's a little weird, our foreign policy. It's definitely better than under Trump. He was really psychopathic. President Biden is normal, rational, capable of absolutely capable of diplomacy. But there's a lot of legacy that is continuing, just almost by rote. And also the Democrats are always afraid of right-wing Republicans yelling at them for being soft, whether it's soft on Iran, soft on China, soft on Maduro. So they're always afraid to change. But there are at least sensible people in this government, and there were not in the last government, because sensible people in the last government were thrown out on their ear in a moment because it was such a corrupt, nasty, violent, and irrational administration in the United States. Now there's some chance actually for rationality. I don't know how they feel about the state of Florida for the 2024 elections and all the rest, but frankly, that's the only driver from a public opinion point of view in the United States. No one else in the United States has a clue about what's really happening. So they have some freedom of maneuver if they choose to use it. The last thing that I would request actually of the Venezuelan government is that when Mark and I wrote in, I don't even remember, 2019 or 2020 about the mortality data, there were barely any data available. And so we took out of the air what we could find. We said that this signaled something that was, very ominous, but we didn't really have information that was serious on the ground, capable of verification and so on. We signaled that there was some dire risk of what was happening. And I'm sure, by the way, that the social consequences are very serious. But I would suggest to the Venezuelan government, get an international group together to do a serious epidemiological assessment of what is going on in terms of hunger, caloric intake, poverty, displacement, mortality rates, disease burden, because this is the evidence that's needed to establish the kind of criminality of this policy. And it's important to have a rigorous base. And because it's so easy for the United States to say, oh, why should we believe anything that those liars are telling us? Do it internationally with a reputable independent group. But we need to know that. And anyway, the government needs to understand it, and the world needs to understand what's happening. I'm afraid of what we'll find. I'm sure we're going to find a lot of hungry people, a lot of people that are suffering, a rise of infant and child mortality rates. You don't go into an economic collapse like this without dire consequences. And I think that it is very important that we establish the epidemiological implications of all of this. So just to say, this is a kind of madness that goes on because it's so easy to continue, but it needs to be stopped. And we need to raise the global awareness of the arbitrariness, the flimsiness of this, the illegality of it, the damages of it, the ineffectiveness of this in every way. And as a general matter, we have so many crises in this world right now, from COVID to climate change to other natural disasters. If we don't work together to solve these problems, we are doomed. And so everything that is dividing us right now is not just stupid, it's absolutely dangerous for our survival. Ambassador, thank you for letting me make a few remarks, and hope that I can be helpful going forward.
You were very helpful, Professor Sachs. Thank you very much for your intervention, and thank you for this optimistic approach, even if I hope in any case that we could really work on that sense and that direction. I hope in any case that many of the political decision makers in your country could listen carefully about your very positive remarks. And I am confident in any case that I hope in a very short term we could be with more peaceful, constructive approach from the foreign policy of United States in any case to build a strong cooperation. I guess that we all win if it would be the case. Muchas gracias al profesor Sachs, decía yo, por esta dosis de optimismo realista.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for this optimistic approach. Thanks for the transparency. And with this, the presentations are over. This cycle of presentations that we have planned for this second session of our academic international conference. We have received several questions, and our academic conference is being followed on the different platforms such as YouTube, Periscope, Facebook. There are several media outlets that are broadcasting from Zoom. So there are hundreds of people that are currently bringing forward their comments and questions, and I thank you and I thank all the members of the panels and guests for their participation in this Q&A session that we're going to start. But before, I'm going to offer the floor, because we still have some time left, so I'm going to give the floor to some of the ambassadors of different countries to the UN that have asked to address the floor to speak about their national positions on this subject that is bringing us together in this meeting. In the event other ambassadors may want to also address the floor, you can raise your hand. In any case, while this takes place, I would like to welcome as well other important guest, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Nicaragua to the United Nations.
Welcome our dear Ambassador of Sri Lanka here in Geneva. We were very welcome, as well as the Ambassador of North Korea here to the United Nations in Geneva. Be very welcome here. And as I can see, other ambassadors, even if they are not with their camera on, are also our guests right now, and we are very thankful to them. I now would like to give the floor, if it is possible, to our dear friend and brother, His Excellency, the Ambassador Hussam Eddin Ala from the Republic of Syria, to take the floor and to give us his impressions on this activity. Please, Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Rosales.
Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon and morning to colleagues and participants
colegas,
in
embajadores y participantes.
I warmly congratulate Venezuela
Quiero felicitar a Venezuela
and Geneva School of Diplomacy on a
y
successful
a la Escuela de Diplomacia de Ginebra por haber organizado exitosamente esta conferencia internacional. Y quisiera agradecer de igual manera a los distinguidos panelistas por sus presentaciones.
Which I hope would be widely heard outside of this event.
Que puedan volver a ser escuchadas luego de que concluya este evento. Las medidas coercitivas unilaterales han sido condenadas como una práctica ilegal e inmoral en docenas de resoluciones emitidas por la Asamblea General y el Consejo de Derechos Humanos de la ONU. Si continúan aplicándose, el desarrollo y los derechos humanos van a continuar reduciéndose en los países en vías de desarrollo, y estas sanciones o medidas coercitivas unilaterales tienen incidencia en los derechos humanos de las personas en los países que son sujetos a estas sanciones, además de los crímenes de lesa humanidad que se derivan de las situaciones de emergencia producidas.
Explained how our countries targeted by UCMs were able to achieve remarkable results in controlling the pandemic, benefiting from the experience of countries in similar situation. And I think this should call for more enhanced cooperation between countries affected by unilateral coercive measures. But at the same time, the fact remains that COVID-19 pandemic has caused a global crisis which requires global responses.
Una crisis que tiene implicaciones a mediano y largo plazo. Tenemos que hacer un llamado para la solidaridad internacional que ha hecho por el secretario general y la alta comisionada de los derechos humanos. Debido a la imposición de estas medidas durante la pandemia, se hizo un llamado para su suspensión, pero en muchos casos fue intensificado su uso en el caso de Siria.
Controlar la pandemia, no solamente dañando a los países, a aquellos países y la vida de sus ciudadanos, sino también poniendo en peligro el bienestar colectivo de todos nuestros países. Dr. Duhan, la relatora.
A report to the General Assembly has extensively addressed the negative impacts of unilateral coercive measures, including the impacts of measures targeting the financial sector and the freezing of financial assets in foreign banks, which has limited the ability of countries to finance procuring their basic needs, including in the medical area. And the report has addressed the impact of UCMs on the overall socioeconomic situation, including on national health system and on the work of humanitarian agencies in targeted countries. The so-called humanitarian exemptions, which are normally flagged by Western officials to deny the humanitarian effects of UCMs, prove to be no more than fake claims without real effect on the ground. Our experience has shown that these so-called humanitarian exemptions are only drafted in a way to remain on paper. This shows, of course, that Western countries which are imposing unilateral coercive measures under the pretext of protecting human rights are in reality violating the enjoyment of human rights by the very same people they claim to protect. This conference has addressed the illegality of unilateral coercive measures from different perspectives and underlined the need to allow the resort, not to allow the resort to the imposition of unilateral coercive measures to continue unaccounted for. And of course, cognizant of the weaknesses of the international system and the power of sanctioning countries, as has been said by different panelists today and yesterday, I believe that the international community and the countries that are concerned about preserving a multilateral system which is based on international law and respect for the Charter of the United Nations do have a special responsibility to stop, to discredit and resist these destructive practices. And I think we have heard today important and valuable suggestions by different panelists about how to do that in the coming future. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Muchas gracias, estimado y apreciado hermano.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and please transmit all of our solidarity to the people of Syria. You know, we are shoulder to shoulder with you in this important stage of consolidation of our relationship, and we would like to congratulate President Assad for his victory in the elections. Now I would like to offer the floor to our dear friend and brother, His Excellency Shashank Laprema, Ambassador of Sri Lanka to the UN in Geneva. And then our brother and friend, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Iran to the UN. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellency. What I have is really a question to the distinguished panelists. It's very seldom that we would have so many distinguished academics on one platform speaking on a topic of this importance, and I would say relevance to the international community. Now, we know that UCMs have been used for a fairly long time. Now, since the end of the First World War, I distinctly remember that China was under unilateral coercive measures. They were under sanctions led by the USA. And that was the period in which Sri Lanka started selling rubber to China, and rubber was among the prohibited items to be sold. So these have been there for a long time. Now, the question to the distinguished panelists would be, to what extent have these sanctions succeeded at the level of the psychology of the people? Now, this is the modern equivalent of siege warfare, medieval siege warfare. Either you give us what we want, or we are going to starve you to death. That is the attitude. So, that being the question, is there any instance from the past where a country has imposed unilateral sanctions on another country, and the people of that targeted country, have come to accept that these sanctions were imposed on us for our own benefit? Have they come to accept the oppressor? Have they come to welcome that pressure that was brought upon their country, upon themselves as well, and to reconcile themselves to that? Have there been any such instances since the end of the Second World War? That's what I wanted to. I am now talking entirely of the psychology of the people, the people of the targeted country. So I was hoping whether the distinguished panelists would have any insight into that question. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, estimado embajador.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now it is my pleasure to offer the floor to our brother, His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of Iran to Geneva, Brother Ismail Bahail Khamenei, so the floor is yours, Your Excellency. Ambassador Ismail, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Hector. I congratulate the government of Venezuela for this very timely initiative, and I would also like to thank all the panelists for their brave and insightful comments and remarks on the inhuman nature of unilateral sanctions. Much has been said about the negative impacts of UCMs on the enjoyment of human rights, and as well as its humanitarian consequences. And I think we have no other choice other than continuing to speak out against this malignancy. What matters most, however, is how could we expose the true nature of UCMs that are truly genocidal and atrocious? How could we sensitize the general public, especially in the West, about the illegality and criminality of unilateral sanctions? Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you for your brilliant remarks. You refer to the fact that the American public have no idea about the inhuman damage these sanctions are causing for the targeted population. And that's why I think the need for public awareness raising, especially in the North, about the negative impacts of UCMs is extremely critical. Unfortunately, Western mainstream media are both reluctant and reductive with respect to the atrocious consequences of unilateral sanctions. They are strongly inclined to proactively underestimate or even cover up the humanitarian implications of unilateral sanctions. This is deliberate and in support of their state's established policy to justify unilateral sanctions either as a lawful tool to tame their adversaries or, and I think this is simply very untrue and outrageous as much as it has been convincing to their public, unfortunately, to present it as a lesser of two evils, to prevent war. Almost all West-based international human rights NGOs, again, unfortunately, are fully or partly in compliance with this state policy and rarely even raise an eyebrow about the impacts of unilateral sanctions on human rights of the targeted populations. So this is something and somewhere that we really should try more. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has created a new momentum to recognize the utterly senseless and inhuman nature of unilateral coercive measures and their lethal impacts on the affected populations. One can say that UCMs are now turning genocidal to the targeted people and overly threatening to the global public health as they are undermining international cooperation to curb the pandemic and to treat the patient. No one can deny that unilateral coercive measures are both wrongful under international law and criminal under international criminal law. So if that's the case, if we agree that UCMs are wrongful, their recognition and implementation by other states lack any legal or moral justification. The states are obliged under international law not to recognize and give any effect to the consequences of any wrongful act. They should then avoid enforcing unilateral sanctions, what we are calling under the general name of secondary sanctions. Otherwise, they could be held to account as complicit in that crime. Another point which was again raised by some panelists and by my dear colleague from Syria, ambassador of Syria, is the fact that there is no such thing as humanitarian exception. We know that unilateral coercive measures leave sweeping impacts on the targeted people without any discrimination as to age, gender, status, religion, whatsoever. And I think there should be no illusion. There is no so-called humanitarian exception other than on the paper. It is a sham. It's a big lie. The fact that the US, for instance, continues to defy the ICJ's interim measures issued on 3rd October 2018, ordering the US, and I quote, to lift sanctions linked to humanitarian goods and civil aviation imposed against Iran, end of quote, is very telling in this context. Here again, I wish really to, I wish I could share the optimism voiced by Professor Jeffrey Sachs in regard to the change in US behaviors concerning its what may be called as addiction to unilateral sanctions. The current administration, unfortunately, has failed to distance itself from the malign and bullying policies of its predecessor. Instead, they are willfully and wickedly instrumentalizing the Trump administration's infamous legacy to extract more concession from what they regard to be their adversaries. After 3 or 4 months of new administrations in the White House, we don't see any change in their policies as far as the sanctions are concerned. Another point, again, regarding secondary sanctions. I think we all have heard, and perhaps many times we have repeated, that complacency leads to complicity. The responsibility of those states that apply UCMs should be addressed as well. The states have an obligation under international law not to recognize the wrongful acts, unilateral wrongful acts of other states. They should ensure that their sovereign rights and privileges, as well as their international human rights obligations, are not compromised as the result of their passive application of secondary sanctions imposed by other states. The EU's blocking statute could be a good example of necessary legislation to shield companies against secondary sanctions. However, this statute has remained ineffective in the absence of minimum political support to secure the European companies from potential reprisals by the US. So in fact, these legal tools have had no effect in fighting against the unilateral sanctions by the United States. I tend to agree with some speakers, some panelists who said yesterday that we should continue our just cause of speaking out against these unilateral sanctions. We understand that unfortunately our world is not necessarily ruled by law or by moral norms, but still I think we should not stop saying the right things, that these sanctions are truly against international law, against international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, apreciado Ismael, por tu intervención, que agradecemos y compartimos además.
Thank you for your kind words, and we would like to thank you for your academic approach that is linked to the international state of affairs after so many decades of suffering from your sister nation of Iran due to the application of these coercive unilateral measures. Now, I would like to start with the question and answer session and offer.
I would like to give the floor to another friend, ambassador, who accompanied us yesterday and today, the ambassador of Zimbabwe to the United Nations in Geneva, Stuart Harold Commerberg. And I give him the floor so he can give us his thoughts on this activity. Ambassador, I do not see you on the screen. Are you there, sir? Perhaps he had some connection problems. Therefore, I propose that we start with the question and answer period. If Ambassador Commerberg is back, then we will be able to give him the floor. As yesterday, I'm going to read the various questions posed to the speakers, and then we will give back the floor to them according to their interventions, so they can close their comments. before we close our activity. We have received a lot of questions and concerns. Therefore, we are trying to summarize some of these questions. Professor Chavas, first question. What are the mechanisms Venezuelan citizens or any other citizens of any other country suffering from these measures to pursue criminally, legally, the authorities of those countries applying those sanctions? If those mechanisms do not exist, what should we do about it? What mechanisms should be created for them? Interpreters have requested that we do not change the language. The ambassador is going to speak in English, so the interpreters are going to translate into Spanish.
In the history of the International Criminal Court, it has ever been a rolling case when a set sanctions is effectively revoked. And the next one, are we in front of a long-term run of legal proceedings? If so, how many years? If the closure will take decades, then we should know this to be prepared for a long siege on the country. Y una última pregunta, gracias a los traductores, a quienes aprovecho de agradecer por todo el apoyo en estas jornadas. Además,
well, thank you to the interpreters. Last question to Dr. Chavas. The responsibility to protect, R2P, has been used to aggress the Venezuelan population. Can we talk about a license to torture with this R2P mechanism? Is a license to torture? Now to Professor Correa. First question. Negotiations conducted in the World Health Organization regarding measures to tackle the pandemic. Some countries have not accepted the link between the UCMs and the capacity of countries targeted by these measures to deal with the pandemic. How can we do? What is the empirical evidence to establish this link? Second, we have witnessed how international financial institutions impede the purchase of vaccines to the Venezuelan people, to the COVAX. Not only the Venezuelan state, other countries such as Iran also affected by these measures. They have had difficulties in purchasing COVAX vaccines. What are alternative mechanisms we have to prevent international financial mechanism to work with those imposing unilateral coercive measures? Finally, they ask us to widen further the fact that to exercise power does not mean that you are a leader. For Professor Timofey, first question. From the commercial standpoint, the UCMs can be deemed as non-tariff barriers? And an example of these barriers can be seen in the partial treaty number 14, signed between Argentina and Brazil in the framework of the Montevideo Treaty of 1980. Some examples that could be given in this field. Second question. Where a young business person could go in order to denounce this UCM within the UN in Venezuela or other countries, impeding the development of his or her economic activity, where they can resort to? For Professor Weisbrot, first question. Peoples have the right to live in harmony, peace, and security. UCM undermine these rights and deteriorate the quality of life of peoples and generate generational pain. How can we repair these damages that cannot be quantified? And this has to do with the question posed by our dear ambassador of Sri Lanka regarding the psychological aspect of these UCMs. Second question, a topic mentioned by Mr. Weisbrot. How can we fight the fake news disseminated on Venezuela in the US media? For Professor Sachs. And again, we are going to change the language because this question is in English.
International Monetary Fund has refused to assist Venezuela by denying recognition to President Maduro's government. What do you think how IMF can be nudged out of its current complacency? Denying recognition to a government is a contradiction of the long-term principle of international law, territorial control, which is recognized through the world. Existe una otra intervención también para el profesor Sachs, que tienen que ver.
There is another question for Professor Sachs. The inconsistency that might exist between the apparent will of the United States to lead climate change, but at the same time, they willfully apply UCMs which have an impact on the real possibilities of some countries to fulfill SDGs and the Paris Accord on climate change. Now, we are going to give the floor to each one of the panelists for them to answer the questions and for closing remarks. Professor Sachs is requesting the floor. For agenda reasons, Professor Sachs, you have the floor.
I so much apologize. I don't mean to jump in front of the queue, but I actually have to leave. So I wanted to just say a couple of very quick things, and I apologize again for asking for the floor in advance of all my colleagues. One thing for the longer term we should think about is, of course, creating alternative means of payment, alternative banking system settlements, because the power for the US to be able to impose this is a very practical tool through the SWIFT bank clearing. It's not the only reason why countries abide by this, but it's a major reason. So if there is clearing in renminbi, if there is clearing in rubles, if there is clearing in euros, there's a much better chance. So we should think very practically about how to undermine the US monopoly on interbank settlements so that these sanctions are just rendered less effective, because after all, this is just one country imposing its will on the whole world. And the reason it's able to do that is for one reason only, not because it's such a large country and all the rest, but because settlements are made in dollars. And that's, of course, the political reach is big, but if there were practical settlements that were made by institutions that could not be sanctioned by the US, I count on China and others to help on this, this would weaken this illegal tool considerably. Second point I wanted to make, because many of the speakers mentioned it very quickly, and I apologize. We need a global humanitarian accounting for Venezuela, for Iran, for other countries hard hit, to systematically put this record in front of the world What are the macroeconomic consequences? What are the health consequences? What are the education consequences? And so forth. I am ready to help in that because I think if we had a network of universities working on this, we would be able to do something practical. I would ask our colleagues who are on the line, who are the experts in international law, to just give us a brief compendium of why all of this is so clearly illegal under international law, because that will help. And finally, I just wanted to say to the ambassador of Syria that not only did your country suffer from financial sanctions, you suffered from the absolutely typical illegal U.S. covert military, not so covert, but CIA operations. And the American people do not understand this at all. And our media made it look like all violence was a Syrian civil war when it was a direct attempt to overthrow the Syrian government. And we could not get the mainstream media to report on what was staring us in the face of Obama and Clinton and others saying Assad must go, and then signing presidential orders of Operation Timber Sycamore and others to overthrow your country's government. So the problem is there's no historical knowledge, record, memory, and the lawlessness continues because of this, and the costs are horrendous. And so everything we could do collectively to help make the facts known in a systematic way, I think is a help. And I just want to contribute to that in any way. I live in a country of relentless lying and a media which is either a part of the lying or just supine and doesn't understand or doesn't dare to contradict the official channels. But we need to get the objective facts, which are staring us in the face, better understood by the global public, because I think that this would really help.
Muchas gracias, profesor.
I'm going to have to go, so forgive me, but thanks for letting me participate.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias a usted, al contrario, por haberse quedado con nosotros hasta la sección de preguntas y respuestas.
Thank you for remaining with us in the Q&A session. We're now waiting for the Executive Vice President to join the conference in a few minutes to precisely continue with our activity. But we are aware of your busy agenda, Professor Sachs, so we are very sure that your enthusiastic participation is going to be great for us to continue conducting research on the unilateral coercive measures. Now, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Sabas to offer us answers to the different questions that have been posed. Professor Sabas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. The questions, of course, were generally addressed to the issue of remedies, and I really only spoke to one of them, which is the possible remedy at the International Criminal Court. Using international law and international remedies when it comes to the United States is a very challenging project. The United States has been resistant to international mechanisms within the United Nations and outside since the beginning, since 1946, when African Americans tried to petition the United Nations General Assembly about their treatment within the United States, and things haven't changed very much. The International Criminal Court is limited in its resources, it's hampered in its vision, and it has had a disappointing performance in the nearly 20 years since it's been operational. But some of you will know the famous song by Leonard Cohen when he talks about the cracks. And he says there are cracks in everything, but that's how the light gets in. And we see cracks at the International Criminal Court. Others have spoken about them. Yesterday, I think that that one of the speakers referred to them, how the International Criminal Court is able to crack open a little bit US torture and other conduct in Afghanistan. It is moving closer to being able to address violations in Palestine by Israel. And it has the potential to let a little light in on the unilateral coercive measures. It's not going to be in any way an ultimate solution to the issues, but it's one mechanism that is worth using and activating. Now, I was asked what victims can do. The International Criminal Court is particularly open to the intervention and participation of victims. So I would urge all victims of unilateral coercive measures in Venezuela and those Venezuelans who have left Venezuela to send submissions. They don't have to come through governments. They don't even have to come through organizations. Send the submissions to the International Criminal Court. The information is all there on the website. All this can do is help to build the pressure for the court to take the right decision, because there will be great pressure for it to take the wrong decision, and it will require a lot of courage for them to take the right decision. So they need to be reinforced with those submissions. How many years will it take? Ultimately, it will take many years for the court, if it ever addresses this question properly, to complete its work. But that's not the problem. If the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court decides to proceed with an investigation into the unilateral coercive measures, this will have an electrifying effect globally. It wouldn't matter even if nothing ever came of it, even if nobody was ever charged. The fact that the prosecutor would take a decision would do so much to publicize, to make world public opinion aware of this, and to send shockwaves through the countries that participate in these sanctions. And so all I can do is urge that process continue and that it be supported. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Sabas. Aprovecho para
Thank you, Professor Sabas. Now I would like to welcome Her Excellency Dr. Delcy Rodriguez, Executive Vice President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, that is honoring us with her presence in this final stage of this activity. Even if we are aware that she has followed the activity in detail during the different presentations that have taken place. She has listened several of them. Now we can see her online, and we thank her for her presence. So now, with the authorization of the Executive Vice President, we'll continue with the Q&A session. And now it's the turn of Professor Carlos Maria to offer some final remarks to answer the questions. Professor Correa, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to respond the questions on the presentation I just made. The first was related to denial of certain countries to accept the relationship between these unilateral coercive measures and the deficits that occur in the countries targeted by these measures, and the consequences and the difficulties to handle the pandemic. I think this is unfortunate. The non-aligned movement issued a statement on this topic, and they highlighted in particular the negative impact of these measures on the capacity of the countries targeted to address this pandemic. Now, linking this topic with the comments of Professor Sachs, it is important that within the framework of the WHO to establish a mechanism to be able to generate this information, empiric information. It could be a group of experts that are specialists in issues related to the WHO, so that they can conduct a deeper investigation. There are several groups of this kind that are created in ministries of health of the targeted countries. So it would be desirable that this could happen so that it can be rendered visible, the evidence of the consequences derived from these unilateral coercive measures that have been part of an attack. So regarding the second question, effectively, I've seen information of the blockade that the targeted countries have suffered with regards to the access of the COVAX mechanisms for the acquisition of vaccines. But there is, with regards to COVAX, there's a governance deficit because it's necessary to make a coalition between the there's no multilateral governance of this COVAX mechanism, which explains very well the failure of COVAX to provide a fair distribution of the vaccines. There has been a huge deficit, and the fair distribution has not been possible due to this. A first answer to the question would be to give COVAX or an equivalent mechanism true multilateral governance. Some people are talking about a treaty, about the pandemic. Even if there's no decision made on this regard, the negotiations are moving forward. So it would be important that one of the key aspects of this treaty could be how a mechanism of this kind can successfully achieve a multilateral approach and not to continue with this situation that we are facing now. Because this is this pandemic is one of the worst events we have faced. It's evident the inequality with regards to the access of vaccines. And the second alternatives that was mentioned was to provide an alternate payment system that is not controlled by the US. So that this intolerable situation of not being able to purchase products in USD because the transactions are blocked by the US. So this is a fundamental action to be taken. Now, with regards to the third question on the leadership and hegemon action, leadership, the word leadership suggests the capacity of influencing, but within a framework of values. But what is going on with these unilateral coercive measures is that there is no value framework. On the contrary, so the values instead are vulnerated by these arbitrary measures. These unilateral measures are opposed to ethics. So leadership doesn't have anything to do with the application of these unilateral coercive measures that are an expression of hegemony and a pure exercise of economic power, and by no means are an expression of leadership. So I would like to briefly answer the question of the Sri Lanka ambassador, whether there is historical evidence in the case of countries that have been targeted by these unilateral coercive measures, if they have understood somehow that these measures were applied for their own good. So I don't think any of the countries affected have understood these measures as applied on their benefit. Part of their suffering, instead, is a consequence of these measures. And the incorrectly called humanitarian exceptions that were highlighted by the ambassador of Iran, that these exemptions are not a way out from this unfair treatment that violates the set of rules and the set of ethical values of a multilateral system. Thank you, Ambassador, once again for this opportunity to answer this question. Thank you, Professor, and the South Center for the support in these activities. Now I would like to offer the floor to Dr. Ivan Timosev for his final remarks.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Well, I will try to react on the question raised. Well, the first question was about sanctions and protectionism. I would say that yes, at some point sanctions may be used as an instrument of protectionism or to promote the national business of the initiator states. To some extent, that's the case of Nord Stream 2, when the United States are almost explicitly stating that sanctions against Nord Stream 2 have the political substance, but at the same time, they could allow American producers of gas to have more favorable conditions in Europe. But at the same time, sanctions may harm American business itself. An example is a number of projects in the Arctic, which American oil companies had to quit and to lose the revenues and profits from this project. So this is something double-edged, and not necessarily sanctions bring profits to their business of initiator state. As for delisting, well, that's a very hard procedure, and there are two ways to do this: either in administrative way, to try to get delisted from the sanctions list, or to go to court, either in Europe, for instance, or in the United States. In Europe, it's a bit easier to get delisted via the legal procedures. In the United States, it's harder and it's quite expensive. But still, even in the UK, our analysis shows that the majority of cases in 2020 were unsuccessful. And last but not least, about alternative financial system, alternative financial instruments. Well, that's a fair point, and it's theoretically that's the right goal. But in current conditions, it's quite hard to achieve, because business is very interested in dollar system. Russian government is doing a lot to de-dollarize the economy and to promote the bilateral relations in terms of national currencies, but still we are quite constrained by their role of dollar and interest of business in dollar. So this process would take time. It would demand multilateral measures, and this is a task which should be in the radars, but take into account that it's quite hard to get implemented. Thanks a lot.
Muchas gracias, profesor Timofeev. Ahora me place ofrecer...
Thank you, Professor Timofeev. Now I'm going to give the floor to Professor Weisbrod so that he can share his final remarks and respond to different questions and comments that have been presented during the conference. Professor Weisbrod, you have the floor.
Yes, so I guess the two questions that were directed towards me are how can we repair the damages from sanctions? And people have addressed that already. And I do think that the idea of reparations is something that could be noticed more here in the US than in the past, because it's come up. You know, we had the largest street demonstrations in the history of the United States by far. 15 million people, according to the New York Times, were in the streets and around the movement for Black Lives. And reparations is now being talked about a little bit more. And I think people are starting to see this connection. In fact, it moved the Congress a little bit between the racism and racist violence in the United States and our foreign policy. And I think that actually had an impact on Democratic members of Congress in the recent conflict in Israel-Palestine. So I think it is something that could get to the agenda, I guess. And the other question was, how can we fight fake news on Venezuela? And that is hard. But, you know, we've been doing it for more than 20 years. And, you know, I remember when I first met with President Chavez in 2003, I think it was, and he told the story of how he went to the New York Times, he flew here and to the Washington Post and met with the editorial boards, and nothing changed, and he kind of gave up. And I think that it was, I know everybody has limited time, I don't blame them, and all of you do too, but I do think that, you know, having spent a lot of time with these media, it's who was Professor Chavez said about the cracks. There are cracks in all the I know all these media. I mean, I've seen a whole bunch of reporters get fired over the years for trying to report the truth. There's people who they don't have tenure like in a university, but they're there. And I think it's worth it for any government that has at least can afford one person to spend their time with media. You will get some change because there are big differences of opinion within the media, but also within the so-called what do you call it? The foreign policy establishment, or they call it the national security state here. You know, the 17 intelligence agencies, State Department, Pentagon, National Security. You know, you have differences. And that's why Latin America is the toughest, by the way. They don't have any real differences there like they do on Iran, or they do on Afghanistan, or even Israel, Palestine. Within these institutions in Latin America, they all speak with one voice. They think it belongs to them. And, you know, we're going to get it back is been what they've said and done for the whole 21st century. But it is still possible. And I think that's, you know, if you just look at it as you have diplomatic relations with a hostile state, it's the same thing. Again, I'm not recommending anybody waste their time with it if you don't have the time and resource to convince some of these journalists. And I could give examples. There's not time. So thank you.
Gracias, profesor Weisbrot. Gracias también por ese trabajo tan detallado.
Thank you, Professor Weisbrot. Thank you for this thorough work that you conduct trying to build an alternative discourse in the US. Before passing to the conclusion and the final stage of the conference, I'm going to offer the floor to two ambassadors that requested to address the floor, and they expressed that they wanted to address the members of this conference. The first is His Excellency, the Ambassador of Zimbabwe to the UN, Mr. Cumberbatch, who has come back to the conference, and finally, our brother Khalid Hafle, Ambassador of Pakistan to the UN. I'm going to offer him quickly the floor, and then we will pass to the conclusion stage. Ambassador Cumberbatch, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Excellency. Can you hear me? You can hear me okay? Very good. All right. Thank you very much indeed, Excellency. First of all, to you, to the mission for organizing this very, very interesting and thought-provoking seminar. Thank you also to the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Thank you also to the panelists for their very, very interesting and again, thought-provoking presentations, both yesterday and today. I thought it would be useful if we could just have a few minutes to explain perhaps our own situation in Zimbabwe, and you will see the very strong parallels there are with the situation with regards to these unilateral coercive measures as they apply, as they affect Venezuela. Like Venezuela, of course, Zimbabwe's been a victim of these measures for some 20 years now, as imposed by Western nations. They have had a significantly negative impact upon all sectors of our economy, most especially the banking and financial service sector, and that affects literally everybody in the country, both directly and indirectly. And undeniably, impacting on the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to health, the right to food, education, and other social services. The genesis of sanctions against Zimbabwe go back to the year 2000, when the government of the day embarked upon a massive land reform exercise designed to correct the racially skewed ownership of land, which the situation had been inherited at independence in 1980. Punishment by Western countries in the form of sanctions was very swift. Suspension of budgetary support, or bilateral cooperation programs, visa bans, asset freezes, full arms embargo, blanket sanctions on our defense industries. They were also imposed. In 2001, the US Congress passed an act called the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which inter alia, and I just want to quote, it compels its representatives to each international financial institution, and I quote, to oppose and vote against any extension by the respective institution of any loan, credit, or guarantee to the government of Zimbabwe, or any cancellation or reduction of indebtedness owed by the government of Zimbabwe to the United States or to any financial institution, end of quote. That act of Congress was further supplemented by a presidential executive order in March 2003, which declared Zimbabwe as an extraordinary threat to US security and foreign policy interests. And those sanctions have been renewed annually ever since that time. The EU and the UK, as it left, the EU have also imposed their own sanctions from 2002 and renewed every year since then. They all insist that their measures are targeted and have no impact at all on ordinary Zimbabwean nationals or on national economic performance. They tell us repeatedly that the economic challenges we face as a nation are due to, quote, gross economic mismanagement and corruption, end of quote. In parallel, of course, and we've heard this, and I think it parallels a lot with what has been, it synchronizes well with what a number of the presenters have said. As these states twist, tighten the sanctions noose on the government, they massively increase their humanitarian aid, which is always, delivered in the name of the people and to support the people and to make up for the failings of the central government. And of course, they never do it through government. They always do it through civil society or through the UN. Indirectly, of course, by significantly increasing their humanitarian aid, they're actually acknowledging, in a way, the collateral damage their sanctions are having upon Zimbabweans, way beyond the targeted few they say that they are focusing on. As was clearly stated by Professor Falk yesterday, although European colonialism has been soundly defeated, Western neocolonialism appears to be alive and well. And in the case of Zimbabwe, and I'm sure it's the same in Venezuela, with Venezuela, the ultimate objective of sanctions is to bring about a change of the administration in Harare and to usher in an administration which is more in keeping with what Western powers would like to see. A former US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, in testimony before the US Congress in support of US sanctions against Zimbabwe, stated, and I'm paraphrasing, but that the problem in Zimbabwe is ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party. And he advocated that US policy should aim to separate the ruling party from the people. And that in order to do that, he said, it would be necessary to make the economy scream. His words, not ours. And the Assistant Secretary of State remarked that he hoped that the honorable members of Congress would have the courage, the stomach, to do what needed to be done. So I think we were especially struck also by the words of Professor Falk when he said that for sanctioned countries like Venezuela, like Zimbabwe, and indeed many others, even though international law may well be on our side, that actually seems to carry little, if any, weight with those who impose such sanctions. They're just too big and too strong. Zimbabwe did take its case did challenge the legality of EU sanctions in the European courts, but we lost both the case and the subsequent appeal. But as Professor Falker said, we simply have to keep up the good fight. And in this regard, and I will conclude right now, I believe the practical forward-looking strategy outlined by Professor Duhan in her presentation yesterday is extremely important and warrants our full support. And I really hope that the very distinguished intellectuals and academics and scholars who participated in this event will rally to her call and will work closely with her office. The creation of an academic, professionally researched and scientifically analyzed database detailing the real impact of sanctions on the enjoyment of human rights, I think it could provide powerful empirical evidence of the collateral damage that such sanctions are inflicting on completely innocent people, and might just help tilt the argument in favor of a review, a long overdue review, I might say, of those measures, of the morality and the effectiveness of those measures by those who impose the sanctions. So let me end here, Excellency. Thank you very much again for giving me the floor, for your kind invitation, and this opportunity to share some thoughts with you on this platform. Thank you very much indeed.
Muchas gracias, apreciado embajador.
Thank you, Ambassador Cumberbatch, for your clear remarks. We would like to express solidarity to the people and the government of Zimbabwe. We know that you are facing large challenges due to this challenge, and count on our support and on our friendship to continue our path of anti-hegemony. And before the final segment, I'm going to offer the floor to the Ambassador of Pakistan to the UN, Kanish Ramal Hasmin. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hector Constant, for two things: for convening this important conversation, and I think even more importantly, to really doing a big service to bring very renowned scholars and experts in international law to enrich the discourse, to also provide answers to a number of complex issues. Our participation is also a gesture to express solidarity with the countries and people affected by unilateral sanctions, unilateral coercive measures. This is something that my country has also experienced in the past, but our position is very clear that these unilateral coercive measures or unilateral sanctions which have extraterritorial effects have no basis whatsoever in international law or under international charter. So I wanted to also commend the professors and intellectuals to apply not only just an academic lens, but also a legal lens to this very topical and contemporary issue, which has, of course, far-reaching impacts. So there are real human costs and human consequences arising from the application of these measures. And much has been said, I would not go into detail, but I'm also conscious of the fact that Excellency, the Vice President, is also here, so I'll make it very short. My final 2 points are that there are, of course, many experts have spoken before and have highlighted the options available. I think there are 4 tracks which are important. One is, of course, political and diplomatic track, the legal track, but also I think, and this event, this academic workshop highlights and fills an important gap, and that is the public communications part to amplify the sheer illegality that is occurring in a world where many countries which assert the need for a rules-based international order. And I think it is about time to expose the double standards that are there. The international rule book is very clear. It is enshrined in the UN Charter, it is enshrined in international law in its various dimensions. And it cannot be that there are two rules or violation of those rules and impunity enjoyed by some. So I think these conferences or these workshops also provide us with with a perspective and additional lens to also work on the diplomatic front, but also on the public communications part. So I want to thank Ambassador Constant, you, the panelists, and fellow colleagues, ambassadors, for providing us with this opportunity. I stand much more, enlightened, really benefited from the perspectives, very useful, very helpful perspectives. So thank you again, Ambassador Constant.
Muchas gracias, Excelencia, apreciado embajador Hashmi, por su intervención.
Thank you, dear colleague. Thank you for your participation. Very constructive and very positive on the need to continue increasing cooperation and strengthening the networking to strengthen multilateralism. Very briefly, we are going to give some conclusions. Some of the topics discussed yesterday and today, where there have been a consensus, and immediately we close this productive activity and this very productive academic conference. The conclusions we might have are that the regime of unilateral measures are a political tool used by hegemonic countries on less strong countries, even though it is in breach of international law. Most countries within the UN reject legitimacy of unilateral measures, as being clearly proven by decisions of the Human Rights Council and the UN, especially in 23rd March, number 46.5. Not only they violate the right of people to self-determination, these unilateral measures breach the right to develop and impede the attainment of the SDGs. Unilateral coercive measures, and this is a general conclusion of this event, are cynical, wrongful, and they violate human rights of the peoples, leading to hunger, disease, migration, and death. Regrettably, and this is another conclusion, over the last years, international bodies such as OAS and NATO lend themselves to whiten the illegality of these measures under the pretense of democracy and liberty. Another conclusion is that today we observe savage, brutal multilateralism, which is very dangerous and sly. Unilateralism of groups, NATO, the Lima Group, the United States, and so on, replacing international community based on the false narrative filled with fake news. Another conclusion is that the US has transformed these measures in the main tool of the foreign policies. These measures are more fearful when they try to produce extraterritorial effects, trying to project an imperial order. And these effects are exacerbated when they find complicit and accomplices, the business sectors, and also install fictitious government, which creates a very damageable antecedent. These unilateral coercive measures are presented globally as financial asphyxiation, energy asphyxiation, communications, food provision, health provision, and even individual sanctions. There is such a perversion that they adopt measures that affect the civilian population, feeding a continuous violation of basic human rights. Given the high number of victims, with these measures, the CPI should consider these as rules that violate human rights according to the Rome Statute. Therefore, according to Article 96 of the Charter, a decision should be approved regarding the legality of these unilateral coercive measures, and they should be raised to International Criminal Court. Another conclusion is that these measures have a cross-cutting effect on all fields of international law. However, there are no studies on the link between these measures and the international trade and commercial rules. Therefore, these studies are in the exploratory phase. Therefore, we need to create a database and a network of academics in order to study further this area, even though it is recognized that most experts yesterday and today are at the vanguard on the theory of the effects of unilateral coercive measures. Another conclusion is that these UCMs are an expression of acts of domination through technological, commercial power, control of financial transfers, affecting targeted countries, and so they cannot serve the basic need of their countries and the right to development. The purpose of these measures from the systemic standpoint is to change lifestyles chosen by those peoples, violating ethical and principles and transforming in acts of domination. And finally, although soon we can have a better, more complete conclusions, but regarding what Professor Sack said about the potential scenarios, an important conclusion of this conference is to continue working to create a network of intellectuals on the UCMs so we can create doctrine on the contra-hegemonic academic thought and better knowledge on how to counteract the effects of these criminal UCMs. These are friends, colleagues, some of the large or broad conclusions that we have been able to derive from this international conference that have gathered us for 2 days. Before closing, we would like to take this opportunity to thank all the ambassadors, colleagues who have accompanied us. And now we'd like to invite you to the closing ceremony. If we can go to the first intervention of President of the School of Diplomacy and International Affairs of Geneva, Colum de Sales Murphy,
Colum de Sales Murphy,
who
who
has
has
sent
sent
a video
because of reasons of his
because
agenda. He was not
he
able
could
to
not
be here
attend in person.
with
It
us
is a very
live,
brief
so he
video.
sent a brief
After
video.
that, we're
And
going
after
to
this video, we'll
proceed
have the
to
closing
the
remarks
closing ceremony
by
with the
the
intervention
executive
of the
vice
executive
president of the
vice
Bolivarian
president of
Republic
the
of
Bolivarian Republic of
Venezuela.
Venezuela,
Now we're
Delcy
going
Rodriguez.
to
Now we're going to
see
show the
the
video.
video with the remarks.
Hello, my name is Colin Murphy. I'm the president of the Geneva School of Diplomacy, in Geneva, of course. And some years ago, I was even a candidate for the position of High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I want to expressly endorse the views and the efforts and the initiatives of this conference, both in accordance with Human Rights Council resolution, I think it's 46 or 45/5, 46/5, and UN General Assembly resolution, in which one condemns, as all responsible politicians should, unilateral coercive measures of sanctions and similar on other countries without clearance from the United Nations, either the General Assembly or the Security Council. All of us are in the business of trying to build the international community if we are to live in a safer world, health-wise, and free of war and conflict, and where human rights are protected, encouraged, and increasingly respected. Unilateral coercive measures, unilateral sanctions fall today now on some 30 countries. They've been proven to be ineffective, and they almost always fall on the most vulnerable and the least deserving of the international community. So I am more than happy to endorse the conclusions and the initiatives of this conference. Please get behind it. All responsible politicians at this particularly dangerous time, unsure time in the world, should be in favor of the conclusions of this conference, that unilateral measures lead ultimately back to those who apply them unjustly, and they disenfranchise and damage, in the end, all of us. I heartily endorse this conference, and I endorse the resolutions of the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly. Thank you for listening.
Gratitude for having co-host and co-sponsor of this important event. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Delcy Rodriguez, Executive Vice President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, who is going to offer closing remarks of this academic international conference, international unilateral coercive measures, disrespect of international law, and generations of severe human consequences. Madam Vice President, you have the floor. Thank you, Ambassador Constant. My greeting remarks to hear His and Her Excellencies, to the UN, and to all the people connected from every single part of the world in this very important conference, because of the relevance of this topic of the unilateral coercive measures and the disrespect towards international law and the generation of severe human consequences. This title of the conference conveys a clear meaning of these unilateral coercive measures Several important presenters yesterday and today have shared with us important thoughts. And I want to share with you a clear example of the criminal character of these unilateral coercive measures. On Monday, well, you know that the world has been facing since 2020 this pandemic, and we have denounced several times the inequality of the strategies that are used to combat this pandemic, the inequality in the access of to vaccines, and 87% of the countries don't have access to the vaccines, and countries like us who have been blocked undergo additional difficulties to have access to equipment, to vaccines, among other inputs. And the COVAX mechanism was created. Said mechanism, Venezuela was able to pay an installment of $120 million that corresponds to access of Venezuela to vaccines to be able to immunize an important amount of population. This has not been made public, but I want to take this moment to tell you and to give you an example of the consequences of the blockade. On June 7th, our ambassador in Geneva, Ambassador Constant, received a document issued by COVAX in which is expressed the following. Since April 13, there have been 12 transactions made by Venezuela for an amount of $109 million with a pending balance of $10 million. Why is this balance pending? Venezuela paid the full quota paid, but the last payment of $10 million, the last 4 payments that were attempted by Venezuela were blocked, and COVAX sent us a communication stating this. With regards to the 4 payments that you attempted, we have to confirm to you that we have been notified by the bank that these payments had been blocked and that they are under investigation. So this, they use block, the verb block. So the resource to pay the vaccines for Venezuela within the framework of the COVAX, $10 million, were blocked. So this is to show you and to show our people, we still have a capacity of paying, but we are not in control of the financial system, because the financial system is controlled by the American lobby, and they have the power to block the resources that we are trying to use to immunize the population of Venezuela against the COVID. But we have asked the following question. So immunizing only the people of 10 countries, is it going to be possible to overcome this pandemic? And the scientists have answered this question. It's impossible to get rid of this pandemic if immunity does not take place in the rest of the countries. So the situation can even get worse. If this immunization process is not completed, other virus may appear. So that's why we wanted to share this information with you. So there were rumors that Venezuela hasn't paid, but in the last stage of the payment, the bank decided to block the $10 million we were using to pay the vaccines, because this is an example of the exercise of hegemonic power and the control of certain factors of the international financial system and the domination of dollar on the financial system. And I have listened to all of your presentations since yesterday, and I have heard in detail everything that you have said. Nobody can deny that the unilateral coercive measures are a terrible crime against the people and the countries that are targeted with these unilateral coercive measures. Nobody can deny that they are a crime. Nobody can deny the terrible effects and the impact of these unilateral measures against population, the terrible effects on the collective right of the people to development and to sustainable development. This is a violation, a global violation to international law, to the United Nations Charter. And I have to say, since I'm a representative of a country that has been targeted by a blockade and by these measures, we feel defenseless. We don't have the mechanisms to be implemented to counteract this. And that's why President Nicolas Maduro is pleased with this conference, and I thank you for your efforts to denounce the meaning of these unilateral coercive measures. We have had the participation of two independent rapporteurs of the UN, Dr. Elena Duran and Dr. De Sayas. They know, and all of you know, the meaning of this. For example, the meaning of the blockade against Venezuela. And I would like to extend greeting remarks to all the scholars that have expressed their opinion on this. Dr. Carmelo Borrego mentioned yesterday that these measures are extortive measures. These are indeed extortive measures. This is blackmail against the people of the targeted countries. Venezuela is in the fifth position of the list of countries sanctioned, and only one of these unilateral measures have been lifted to and the sanction was lifted with regard to a person that contributed to an attempt of coup d'etat in 2002. So you see the nature, the political intention of the system of unilateral coercive measures, which geopolitical objective is to change the government in Venezuela. And those countries that decide not to accept the orders of the West, those who there are affected. When you see the list of the 30 countries that have been targeted by these unilateral measures, you see that are those countries that do not follow the instructions of the US. So yesterday was mentioned the slide power, in which you see that the OAS and the NATO precisely bring forward these coercive unilateral measures to simulate that we are in the presence of multilateralism. Multilateralism instead needs to have a meaning of defense in the light of these flagrant violations against human rights. And precisely, in the case of Venezuela, in 2019, we decided to present before the ICC referral related to the commission of crimes against humanity. These unilateral coercive measures are a crime against humanity because they systematically violate the human rights of our people. And the people of Venezuela precisely has been a victim of this policy of aggression, of this policy against the human rights in our country. If you wonder what has happened in Venezuela, Professor Weisbrot has studied in depth this topic from the point of view. I have some figures to show you. Venezuela in the last 5 years stopped perceiving income due to a reduction in the oil production, about $100,000. But when you see this slide, for example, that we're showing, you can see the direct correlation between the application of unilateral coercive measures and a dramatic drop in the oil production. So a country that prior to the blockade perceived $60 billion per year, in the year 2020 only received $740 million. So there was a drop of 99% of income in our country as a consequence of these measures. A terrible drop, only experienced by countries in armed conflict or the countries that were involved in the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Second World War. So when you see this dramatic drop in the GDP, when you compare the drop of GDP in Venezuela with countries that are in armed conflict, you can see that the curve is similar. So this has had a remarkable impact in infrastructure and public services, in the public health network, in the distribution of food, in the food production. And this situation led our country to a difficult situation, but our people understand what's going on, and people are fully aware of the historical meaning of Venezuela in Latin America and in the world as an independent voice, as a factor that opposes to hegemony. You see that the Venezuelan people have used creative methods and reinvented themselves, and we have created national mechanisms to overcome the challenges derived from the sanctions. But if we compare Venezuela to the rest of the countries that have been targeted, well, Cuba has been blocked for 6 decades, Professor Salles. Imagine how many resolutions have been passed in the UN General Assembly to support the people of Cuba. And this multilateral institutionality is simply ignored and overlooked by the superpowers of the world that use this blockade as a geopolitical weapon, as a political weapon to topple our governments and to oust governments that decide not to follow the orders of the hegemonic centers of power. The case of Iran, 30 years of blockade, Syria, blocked for 10 years, former countries from the Soviet Union, countries in Asia, in Africa, and Venezuela, that even if we have been blocked for a few years, the blockade implemented against Venezuela has been brutal. We were completely excluded from the financial international system. And the blockades in Venezuela and in the sanctioned countries become a strategy to take the resources away from the people, because the transactions for Venezuela are more expensive because of the blockades, but they end up being taking place in the financial system. So I'm pleased with the proposals you have shared here by Professor Sachs, Professor Weisbrot, and other important presenters that have spoken about alternative methods. So the countries affected need to join efforts to counteract this. And in the case of Venezuela, in 2020, we were victims of intensification of the effects of the pandemic due to these measures. This is a criminal, due to the criminal actions of the government of Trump. Because in the worst moment that the humanity is facing, we saw how our income reduced from $60 billion to $740 million. And that's why the efforts of President Nicolas Maduro are centered on this. And I would like to convey salutation remarks of President Nicolas Maduro. He has emphasized the importance of protecting the most vulnerable sector. Jeffrey Sachs was mentioning how economic warfare takes place in times of peace, but there are riots derived from this economic financial blockade. So we have heard and we participated in a meeting with the Treasury ministers in Latin America, and there was discussed how the IMF was going to address the situation derived from COVID, and they were going to create a special mission. And the first thing they said, Venezuela will be excluded from this policy in that discussion. Are we seriously talking about wanting to control the pandemic, or are we going to continue seeing these perverse double-edged mechanisms to exclude the countries that are blocked and illegitimately sanctioned? So I call upon everyone through this space to reflect on what's going on within the context of the pandemic, with the exclusion of multilateral financial mechanisms to address the problem of the pandemic. Venezuela is punished, and the Venezuelan people is punished. And Dr. Elena Duan mentioned this about the impact of these unilateral coercive measures on the economic system and the disturbances, the same rules of capitalism, the severe violation to the World Trade Organization rules. Venezuela is prevented from accessing medicines. So suppliers are threatened, and they're called, telling them not to sell products to Venezuela. So even the neoliberals are losing out of this situation. And the neoliberalism has denaturalized because the blockade is promoted as a political weapon. The position of Venezuela in the light of this blockade, well, Venezuela is in the 5th position, the level of these 30 countries that have been targeted with sanction. And we have the 2nd largest number of sanctioned aircraft and also vessels to prevent the commercialization of Venezuelan oil. It's the 5th country with the largest amount of sanctioned companies, and the 6th country with the largest amount of sanctioned individuals. So all the demons have been directed against the Venezuelan people. So we do hope that the multilateral institutions, such as the ICC, can give clear results against the blockades, and so that responsibility can be determined. I agree with the proposal that have been expressed here. I think it's very important to create an international jurisprudence on this topic. We need to call upon the different schools of international affairs in the world and the schools of law to actively study the consequences of these blockades and to pronounce themselves on this regard. I agree with the mechanism of reparation and indemnity, because the peoples that are targeted by these sanctions are prevented from developing and from having peace. All the rights that the free people must have, and especially the right to self-determination. So the countries that have been targeted by the unilateral coercive measures must join efforts, but we need to also raise our voices to let the other countries of the world that are not aligned with these aggressive measures that are expressions of power. I really thank you for being here. We wanted to share with you the truth of Venezuela. We wanted to tell you what has been the meaning of the pandemic for Venezuela. We are blocked. Our resources are blocked in the Bank of England. We have spoken about this. The laws of capitalism were even vulnerated by these persons who have applied these rules. Because, for example, we cannot keep our gold in the financial system of England. If any other country decides to put their gold in England, they might experience the same that Venezuela has suffered. There are other countries sanctioned in our continent: Cuba, Nicaragua. There, more than 30 countries have been sanctioned. This list of countries sanctions may grow the imposition of parallel and artificial governments to control the resources of the Venezuelan government. This is unseen. The Congress of the United States passed a law in which they include in their budgets the resources to give to this parallel government that intends to replace the legitimate government of Venezuela. This is something that may happen to other countries. So it's important for the rest of the countries that believe in independence and in self-determination and in sovereignty to join our voices and our efforts so that we can act together so that the UN truly fulfill its duty, that they can turn into a real space where the sovereign countries can count on mechanisms to defend in the light of these violations against international law. This is a major challenge for the UN. We said that to Secretary Guterres during the campaign for the elections for Secretary General. We told him, you have a major challenge. How can the UN create a counterbalance to the superpowers of the world? And we see how the UN try to make fit these measures into the legal framework. So it's a major challenge for the UN. The community of nations, if they want to perpetuate these mechanisms and give a real meaning to multilateralism, must unite efforts for a real democratization of the mechanisms. I want to thank the scholars, the ambassadors, the president of the Diplomatic Academy in Geneva, to all of the ambassadors. We would like to express the certainty that we are on the right track. The law is on our side, as Professor Ramiro said, the collective power when we truly exercise the defense of our right. Thank you, and I hope you have a nice day. Thank you, Madam Vice President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, for your remarks. With this, we would like to formally close the event, and I would like to thank again to all of the presenters that have joined us today. I would like to thank to all the persons that have followed this event in the social media platforms for this important activity, to the colleagues, His and Her Excellencies, to the United Nations and the Venezuelan ambassadors in the different countries, and also the School of International Relations of Geneva for their sponsorship. And I wanted to thank Professor De Sayas for having taken part in this important initiative and joint efforts to have this great panel of presenters that create a solid basis to precisely strengthen international jurisprudence in the matter of unilateral coercive measures and to move forward to develop a counter-hegemonic law. I also want to thank the sisters and brothers from the permanent mission of the UN to Geneva, translators, administrative workers from the different institutions in Venezuela that have joined us today, who have been fundamental for the success of this international academic conference. Have good afternoon in Caracas, have good evening in Geneva, and in the rest of the world. We will continue with this struggle. As the Vice President has said, that can only lead us to victory. It was a pleasure for us to count on your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Senator. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Excelente. Todo muy bien. Excellent.